Well, hello again, guys. It's Christian Bassar speaking to you again. This is the second installment of History Vice video blog, and today I'm thinking about revolutions. It's a very important part of history, of course, military history and human history, of course, where over the millennia, really, we've seen so many revolutions and coups and people throwing over their leaders and then replacing them with, well, themselves. And definitely a lot of things that happen, of course, they happen for various reasons. There may be corrupt leaders or leaders that keep stealing, of course, or they're incompetent, certainly as we see in the case of during World War I, the Russian Revolution, 1917. The Tsar was just, not certainly incompetent there, and the war was going terrible with Germany. And also, and of course, the communists were inspired by, Karl Marx and the theory of communism, of course, and then kind of communism started, or the revolution started there. But I don't want to say that communism started in Russia because, of course, it was written by Karl Marx and Engels, so in Germany. So they were Germans, not Russian. So kind of an interesting idea, actually, and it's interesting how communism originally started from those two Germans, but then it started in Russia, but also Hitler later on during World War II absolutely hated communism. So it's kind of interesting there. And one of the big things I want to mention about revolutions is, although they may replace this current rulers or whatever, and at the time, it sure seems like a good idea. But the funny thing is, a lot of these revolutions turn out to be just as bad or even worse than before. Like we see, tyrannies being replaced. We've seen that certainly in the Arab Spring starting in 2010, and which is still playing out in places like Syria and although Hosni Mubarak was taken down in Egypt during the Arab Spring period, now it's Mohamed Morsi did a lot of the sweeping constitutional changes and was going to make it a big religious conservative state, which kind of split Egypt down the middle. A lot of people were in favor of what he was doing, and a lot of people were not. They were going to say he's going to implement Sharia law and suppress women and all that. So it's kind of interesting, And also there was, I think it was earlier this year or last year. I don't quite remember. It was the military was in big control there too. After Mubarak was kicked out. So it's very, Egypt had had enough of Mubarak, who had been there for many years, for too long. It was, and that's another thing too. Like we're certainly finding with the Arab Spring is a lot of the leaders there have been there for so long, unelected or whatever, and then they just kind of go in there and they stay. And so then people decide it's time to change underwear and change governments. But unfortunately, it's not a matter of just changing undergarments, which is easy. But revolution is a lot more difficult. And as we've seen in Egypt, the new tyranny, so to speak, is in some ways just as bad or not that dissimilar from the old. We certainly see that with the Russian Revolution afterwards. There was all communism started everything in Russia with Stalin with the gulags and everything like that, and that was a few decades after the revolution itself, like about 20 years. But but that's kind of what happened there. The French Revolution. Maximilien Robespierre, one of the big pushers of the revolution to kick out the Bourbon monarchs. It was very interesting because at first he was against the death penalty and everything, and was for fraternité, égalité, and équalité. The fraternity, equality, and I forget the other term. Sorry, but the main motto of the French Revolution, that was his thing, and he spurred people on, and he was a great rhetorical master. He was great with words and everything. And then finally, when the French are kicked out, there's this idea to protect the revolution and suppress anybody that would actually threaten that revolution, threaten their efforts. And even to the point of executing and punishing people for using the title Monsieur instead of citizen. So Monsieur indicated a status or a higher status or something like that, and then no, you have to say citizen, and that I speak a little bit of French, but I'm not sure what the word for citizen is. I don't know if it's citizen or something else, but then and Maximilien Robespierre was kind of a big part of that terror that happened after the revolution, the Great Terror and everything, where a lot of people were executed for not being revolutionary or for threatening the revolution as the revolutionists saw fit. And although they had a great constitution and everything like that, that was pretty much suspended or put aside to protect the revolution. The very thing that was a big part of that revolution, constitution and everything, it's pushed aside to protect the revolution. How does that make sense? So, and Robespierre, even though being against the death penalty before, and suddenly he gets in this state of power almost, and then starts these massacring, really, of hundreds of people, lots of people. And when, if asked about that, times change. They do indeed. So, but it's very interesting. Under the Bourbon dynasty, it was mostly hunger was the big problem, and also neglect from the ruling class and everything like that. And while people outside Versailles Palace are starving, the opulence and I don't want to say hedonism necessarily, but because that was certainly a stereotype that the revolutionaries were using, that inside it was orgies and all that stuff, and the queen was indecent, those kinds of things. Marie Antoinette, let them eat cake and ice cream. So there's those kinds of things, but certainly the opulence of the nobility and the sheer, richness and kind of neglect of the people and everything like that, that certainly led to their downfall. But after they were kicked out, Louis XVI executed, and which was appalling to Europe. It was like, whoa, how dare you kill a king? And also let them eat cake also got killed too. Marie Antoinette lost her head to the guillotine there. And so, but again, as we just talked about with Robespierre, who also took it from the revolution too, he was eventually seen as not revolutionary enough or not supporting the revolution, so he was executed as well. And which is kind of funny, it got bit by the monster he created. And that tyranny became just as bad, if not worse, than the Bourbon dynasty. At least under the Bourbons, there were, lots of people were imprisoned and so on, and a lot of people were starving. But what kind of fear was there? Fear of saying the wrong thing and getting executed, And it certainly doesn't seem as much as during the terror. So that's the thing there. Uh, Chinese Revolution, Communist Revolution is another example. Chinese kick out the Kuomintang in 1949, and Chiang Kai-shek runs to Taiwan. And so the communists in China under Mao Zedong initiates one thing during the 60s, the Cultural Revolution. And that was actually kind of spearheaded by his wife, who was known as Lady Mao, Lady Mao, I believe, and very nasty kind of woman. And she was tried by the Chinese a few decades later, and after Mao died. And during the Cultural Revolution, students were encouraged to they left school, they beat up teachers, that was part of the revolution. It kind of got the young people behind Mao, and they just basically went after schools and anything over the old Chinese culture, even against their parents. Violence was done and everything like that. So it was a very nasty thing. A lot of people died. A lot of people got humiliated, degraded, and actually made the economy crash. Chinese economy crash because so many people all these students were not going to work or anything. The people were just kind of roaming around in these little bands of these the Red Guard and walking around China and everything, and not working and everything. So the economy just goes down. So there's another example of where a revolution takes over and goes out. A lot of it, and you hear in a lot of these historical cases, the justification for the violence or whatever of the revolutionaries is to protect the revolution. We saw that with Robespierre, and also there was a lot of that with Mao's Cultural Revolution, and also over the last few weeks, and we've seen that in Mohamed Morsi, Egyptian president. His sweeping powers to basically become another dictator was in the name of protecting the revolution, and he's backed down on a lot of that stuff. He's not. All the protests and everything started again, and so I guess the lesson of Mubarak was still fresh in his mind, so he probably didn't want to have to deal with that. So right away, basically be in power for about a year or so and get thrown out again. So I guess he didn't want that, so he has backed down on some of those things. And I suppose one exception to this rule of revolutions becoming almost as bad as the ones before it. Libya is one thing. Gaddafi, of course, killed in October last year, and then so the NTC, the National Transitional Council, took over, and it's and so the thing is, after that, there's I haven't heard so much about Libya in the news lately, but the thing is that I know that there was a bit concern, like who's going to take over now. Of course the NTC did, but there was still not quite rigid control and everything like that. And one thing that was very interesting after the revolution and everything, the government bureaucracies were taken down. So government employees weren't getting paid anymore. HR wasn't doing his job because it wasn't there or it wasn't around. So the old government was gone. So that was one thing where a lot of people didn't get paid and whatever. As far as the NTC doing massacres and everything like that, we don't hear about that in the news. So it seems to be a bit more calmer than it has been in in Europe, or not Europe, but Egypt, and also, well, and certainly Syria. They've been fighting for 18, 19 months there, and there's definitely a lot going on there that makes us thankful to be in the West. That's for sure. Not that we're superior or anything like that, but certainly our world is a lot more peaceful. And let's see, there's another thing. And another exception to kind of tyranny replacing tyranny would be the United States, the American Revolution of the 1700s. Then also, I find the American Revolution somewhat interesting because although there was I believe it was the Boston Massacre, where a bunch of colonialists were demonstrating or upset, and then a few were shot, and then that kind of was, the shot that rang around the world. But so there's that aspect of it, but other than that, the British were not really evil minded people going out and raping and killing Americans and just because. The Patriot may show otherwise, but that's Mel Gibson doing a historical movie. We Were Soldiers and Apocalypto was not bad for that. But The Patriot was certainly, I know it's certainly been criticized for its dramatization. It's over. It's showing absolute cruelty of the British and like heavy-handed bad guys like you always see in the movies and things like that. And certainly savagery was done by both sides during the American Revolution. But kind of getting back to my original point was the British were heavy taxmen. They demanded taxes on playing cards. They demanded taxes on sugar, this, that, and whatever. And the Americans were basically upset of taxation without representation. And so, understandable, but I do find it interesting that a whole war was started over that. Also not just taxation, but also the Quebec Act, where basically there was going to be no more further westward expansion into the Ohio Valley. So the Americans were really ticked off at that. And also the Quebec Act made Quebec larger, and so the colony of Quebec larger, which they had gotten from the French a few decades before, and which the British had, and that also really made the Americans incensed and very angry. So those kinds of things, the intolerable acts that the British imposed. There was the Boarding Act, where basically soldiers had to, or American citizens or American colonists had to have soldiers in their homes. So, there's that, I'm certainly probably, I tried to, as said in my intro video, I try to avoid controversy as much as possible, but certainly the American Revolution is certainly very different, extremely different from what's happening in Syria right now, where basically demonstrators were around and a bunch were killed. And, there was the Boston Massacre, of course, yes, but it's certainly the scale of killing was certainly not as much as it was during the French Revolution or what Syria has done, and what was happening in the Arab world over the last 2 years before the revolution kind of took foot and took over and replaced the tyranny and power. So it's kind of different. But anyway, in the end, the American Revolution kicked the British out with a lot of French help. And so the British said, screw this, we're just going to stay in Canada, and that's going to be our North American colony, and we're not going to worry about 13 colonies anymore. But the thing is that America had, in some ways it was better because there was democracy after. There was, while before, like under Britain, there was democracy and everything, like constitutional monarchy. But there was no king anymore in America. There was no so it was a bit different, and certainly there was no there was not a tyranny and course like that. But unfortunately, later on with the Americans expanding westward, there was, as I kind of, well, sort of along the same vein as what I was talking about in my last video, where a lot of harm was done to the natives under Manifest Destiny. The Americans thought that they needed control from coast to coast, and of course all the Sioux and everybody else in the way, it's to push them all out, especially after the Civil War. So, so that and perhaps Libya are definitely exceptions to the rule, but I've certainly found that looking at revolutions in history, it's always, okay, well, new guys in power, but what's going to change? Another example, a quick example, the Iranian Revolution of the 1970s. The old Shah was a nasty little guy. A lot of torture and oppression of the people, and secret police, and given aid from the U.S., by the way. And then Ayatollah Khomeini, a great religious leader, under exile in Iraq, and then eventually deported to France. And actually, that was the Shah actually requested Saddam Hussein in Iraq to deport Khomeini to France to kind of get him out of there, get him out of my sight. But that was actually a mistake, because France, he had better communication, so he could reach more people. So, yeah, so then that makes everything difficult. And then under Khomeini, while the Shah was still in power, he made the people just go wild with his rhetoric and his anti-Shah, anti-Western ideals and protests and everything like that. So, and then eventually the Iranian Revolution in the late 70s, and also, of course, the hostage taking of the embassy for just over a year. And so there's all that, and so of course there was oppression under the Shah and torture and everything like that. But under Khomeini, and then later on with Iran, nowadays we kind of see the same thing, don't we? Very, at least from Western perspective, we certainly see a lot of oppression in that country. So it's not, just because a new guy comes in power does not necessarily mean that everything's going to be all tickety-boo and roses, peaches and cream afterwards. So in many ways that can be taken as an opportunity just to take power and just become the same as the previous guy. And Uganda, under Idi Amin, of course, he took power from Milton Obote in 1971. I believe Milton Obote was at a conference somewhere, and then his top general, Idi Amin Dada, came along and kicked him out while he was out of the country. So Milton went to exile in Tanzania, and so, but in the 8 years that Idi Amin was in power, it's estimated he killed 300,000 of his own people. Stopped river dams from bodies being thrown into the river. So under whatever Milton Obote had done, and everything was certainly replaced by what everybody calls the butcher of Africa. And so, and obviously the situation in Uganda would be a lot worse than what it was. And to the point, when Milton Obote and a bunch of Ugandan generals rose up against Amin, with Tanzanian support and coming from Tanzania, well, Idi Amin declared war on Uganda and went in, and then Tanzania, and then Yaweri Museveni and a bunch of other generals came in and eventually kicked Amin out, and Amin went to exile in Saudi Arabia eventually, and until his death in 2003. And then so Idi Amin taking over from Obote just ushered in this era of terror, secret police, all the classic examples of a terror state. And Yoweri Museveni, he was one of the generals under that went in. They installed Milton Obote, but then there was the Ugandan Bush Wars, and then kind of a civil war there, and then Milton Obote was kicked out by Yoweri Museveni, who's there now. And so, but certainly, Uganda is definitely, there are definitely a lot of issues, that's for sure. There's a lot of poverty and a lot of tension between native, or not native, but the black and Asian communities in that country. And of course, there's AIDS, and certainly over the last few decades, there was, of course, the LRA, which was made famous by the Kony 2012 campaign earlier this year. And, excuse me. So, but certainly under Museveni, we don't hear as much about Uganda as the world did during Idi Amin's days. Certainly not for the same reasons. So that's kind of my thought with, that was a bit long-winded, but, there are lots of examples of revolutions coming in and promising better lives and better situations for people, but then it turns out to be just as bad or even worse than the previous dictatorship beforehand. So it's very interesting. The grass is always greener on the other side, but unfortunately, in terms of revolution, sometimes the blood is redder on the other side too. And it's a very interesting thought. So, we'll definitely see what happens with the Arab Spring for the rest of the year, and so hopefully there'll be a lot of peace and coming soon and everything, and that, if depending on the circumstance, that the world steps up and defends those that can't defend themselves. I think that's certainly been one of the UN's failings in the past. Not all the time, but certainly a lot of times in the past under certain peacekeeping missions that were not well done. And but more on that maybe some other time. But it's but yeah, so keep that in mind. Revolutions are, just because somebody's coming new and replacing a guy that should absolutely be replaced, does not necessarily mean that things are all going to be good. Of course, the change in government. Fortunately, in most of the Western world, we have very smooth transitions to governments and democracy and everything like that. So we're very blessed to have that kind of a system here, where transitions are smooth; they go across. But in revolutions, you have to replace bureaucracy. Okay, you've gotten rid of the old president or whatever. Okay, good. So what laws are you going to have? Like, how are you going to represent the people if you're going to have representative government? Or are you going to be a dictator yourself, which we have seen happen many times? What are you going to do with people loyal to the old regime? The loyalists, what are you going to do with them? Then the bureaucracy, what government employees, people without work. When a government is shut down, like we saw in Libya, a lot of people are going to be without pay. So, there's so many factors, and there's no guarantee that the revolution will be altruistic and everything like that. It may be worse or about the same, and if you're lucky, it might be better than the old regime. But so anyway, that was kind of my meditation of the day, so to speak. And so come up to about a half hour right here. So yeah. So anyway, that's kind of the first lecture of the History Vice channel. And I hope you enjoyed it and made you think a little bit. And if you feel you want to leave some comments or disagree or something like that, just go ahead and type it down, and You guys have a good time, and we'll talk to you later. All right, see ya.